So I mentioned the other day, for those who might or might not have seen it, in a recent video, I mentioned the moment in 1968 when I entered the Franklin and Marshall College campus and saw this new world, summer of love, incipient hippie existence, and how this clashed and really crashed into my world, my father's world of law and order, the young Republicans, all the values associated with restraint. And I hinted at the end of that video something I want to talk more about today, which is that you could see at that moment the genesis in its first steps of the red and the blue. Now we say the red and the blue states, and it means Republican and Democrat, but it could mean the red and blue culture, or the red and blue ideal, or the red and blue conflict, because it's on a much bigger scale than merely the electoral college map as it's construed during any electoral season. And if you go back to that moment, just a few years before the McGovern nomination, already you could think about some of the interesting variables of these two kind of worldviews, is rather maybe giving them too much credit, but attitudes, let's say. In the blue world, which we saw on campus, freedom was the sine qua non, the thing without which life was not good. There had to be freedom. There had to be freedom of expression. There had to be sexual freedom. There had to be freedom of the citizen against the crowd and against the man and against institutions. And this freedom was a kind of magic sauce that could be poured on anything. And that hippie culture was related by a kind of odd marriage to the civil rights culture, because the freedom riders who had come from New York and Pennsylvania and New Jersey and New England were themselves already in that folky, white guy sensitive mode where you had to free those people who were bound. So there was the black voters that didn't have the right to the franchise, and there was Hispanic people that were kept out of housing projects, and there was many cases and problems. And this kind of incipient hippie of 1965, who hadn't yet become the full-blown, Doors listening, Beatles listening, 68, 69 hippie, already had this moral sensibility of his own freedom and everybody else's. And this was the virtue, the power, which governed the model of their thought, meaning that everyone who could be freed must be freed from the restraints of bigotry, paternal domination, sometimes known as patriarchy, gender issues, and these grew. Originally, the hippies were sexist. The hippie woman was one of the most trod upon creatures you'll ever see. She was always in the back of the Volkswagen Beetle bus, sitting there like looking out the window, and she was always an exchangeable item in those hippie days. It wasn't until after 72, 73, 74 that the women's movement really flew in the face of hippie macho, which people don't remember. But that's the way it was. You didn't find the notion of female equity in the great rocker culture, anything but that. If you think of Mick Jagger's persona, if you think of almost any of the famous rockers, the Doors, Morrison's persona, they were all kind of dominant macho figures who really, women were kind of on the side, as in the Doors movie that was made. Women are kind of like decorations of the great hero and the small group of women figures like Grace Slick and others were fighting a kind of battle against the tide in the 60s period. Only later, and really only mostly in the late 70s and 80s, did the women's vocalist and singer-songwriter reach their own independence, and they became very important and dominant in that later period. But what's my point? Freedom was the word on one side. What was the word on the other, on the red side? Even in Lancaster in 1968, it was order. And order meant hierarchy, and it meant police power, and it meant tradition. And tradition meant a tradition of a certain dominating attitude by a certain group of citizens who could judge the others. And what I mean by that is, just as when you went down south, the Freedom Riders went down south, they met with the police and the sheriff and the judge and the state senator and the mayor and the governor, and every one of these officials was a figure representing order and tradition. The tradition happened to be segregationist, the preservation of an inequitable system, but it was order, and that's what they invoked at all times. If we let the Freedom Riders come in, if we permit marches by black citizens, if we permit the reordering of the passengers on the buses, if we let the black people eat in the Woolworths, well, all of this will be disorder, and it will absolutely collapse the structure and order which we've inherited, without which we cannot maintain a grasp on this culture and its value. Now, with that is a kind of supercilious theory about race and hierarchy, but still it's order. It's order on the one side, it's freedom on the other. Now, both of these, in reality, are necessary elements in human life taken as an ideal, because we are free beings who must act freely by conscience and by will on the most important matters. We must affirm in ourselves the most important matters in order to be human. On the other hand, order is the saving, balancing, just power by which we live together. Now, the idea that these could become competing and antagonized elements in a kind of warfare that's lasted all the way till now, till 2018, because today we have the same notes played on the same instruments. If President Trump, for example, says the Border Patrol must be more pointed, more violent, they must take children from mothers, they must be more absolute in their judgment, it's because of order. Because the people who are coming up from Honduras and from Nicaragua or from central Mexico or from the border counties, they are challenging our order. We have legal order. We have the nature of true citizenship. We have the struggle to become an American. And this is an orderly process. And anything that is antagonistic to that, anything that challenges that orderly transfer must be battled against. And we must bring out the police power, local police, the ICE members and the Border Patrol and the National Guard, if necessary, to keep out this army of insolent outsiders who don't respect the American cultural order. And it's always outsiders who have produced this. George Soros paid for the women who yelled at Kavanaugh during his hearing. A communist Greek paid for it. It's always an outsider. Remember, if we go back to 1965, it was outsiders, communists, who came to Georgia and Alabama and said, change your way of life. They weren't Georgians and Alabamans. They didn't know about our world. They were flown in by some left-wing Democratic Party from Boston or New York, and they were communists and socialists. And even Hoover, the head of the FBI, had a file of all these communists who were trying to break up the order of the South, okay? So this is the language of America whenever there's conflict. One side pronounces freedom and human dignity and rights and privileges and constitutional promises, and the other talks about an order, a value of peaceful and a reconciliation, structure of life, respect for law, respect for the police. Those are the symbolic gestures of order, okay? So we're in this seemingly permanent battle and balancing on side A and side B between order and freedom. Now, it's not by any means a natural conflict. A society has to have free agents and has to have value freedom, especially if it's a democratic republic. Perhaps it would be different if it was a plutocracy or an official monarch. Maybe then there would be a different concept of free citizenship. But in this world, created as it is, with a living constitution, well, freedom has to be fundamental. The franchise is a gesture of freedom. All acts of conscience, all assemblies, all public speech, these are all gestures of freedom, and they're protected by law. On the other hand, order is required to have civilization. There has to be police power. There has to be a limit of law. There has to be, things have to be able to be transgressed. But the rhetoric is never one which brings a union. It never brings a reconciliation of these two kinds of rhetoric. No, it's a disorderly group of outsiders who don't understand the true community, which is protected by their own police. Now, if a black man is shot 17 times in the back in Maryland, that's an accident. The police have tension, and they have their own worries and fears, and you'd feel the same way if you were accosted constantly by black criminals. That's the view of the order side. On the other side comes the fact that the black man is hated by the patriarchy, by the system of order, by the hierarchical white authorities, and they want to shoot him in the back 17 times. Now, actually, both sides are wrong. The police don't really necessarily want to shoot the man in the back 17 times, although they might feel they have some kind of right to under tension or anxiety. And on the other hand, neither is it true that we can live in a society with absolute disorder where each person expresses their own autonomous nature and freedom. None of these things are possible. These are impossible fictions and fantasies. And when two fantasies, I don't mean they're fantasies in the sense that we don't need both order and freedom, but that they exist separate and alone as the way of measuring all of our values and actions. This is just an incomprehensible situation. Somebody must start reflecting on what constitutes the virtues of the red, the rural, the old American order, and what constitutes the virtues of the blue, the culture of freedom, of self-expression, of autonomy of the individual. Somebody has to start figuring out what constitutes the value of these and how they can be brought back together in a political unity, in an actual community in which there's a workable, because as long as we pretend that they're indissolvable conflicts, these things, we will never get back to a working legislature, to a national sense of community which we had before the 1960s, before those days of 68, 69. Now, I'm not passing judgment one way or the other on the claims or values of people. Each case has to be judged on its own. But we can see that on the order side, there is a residual element of racism, for example. That's obvious. Anybody who thinks through it will see that that's because it's preserving an older world, which really was a kind of hierarchical race culture. And on the other hand, everybody will see in the freedom side, if they look closely, a kind of revolutionary, unlimited self-expression, which can become chaos and amorality and sexual conflict and unbridled vice. Everybody can see on these two sides we have two conflicting negatives. So the negative and the positive of each of these poles has to be now looked at by the members of our society in a rational way. And who can do that? We see no one in that territory. We see even the press is divided between the orderly Fox people who are defending presidential power and white people who they claim are the most humiliated and mistreated population in the country. A fantastic idea, by the way. And then we have the NBC and CBS and ABC saying, no, we have to save the Native American and the black person, and this grievance is infinite and can never be solved without special interventions and recognitions of a kind of corrupt internal racial. Okay. So given these extremities, are we going to do something? Are we going to say, yes, there has to be freedom and autonomy. There has to be the franchise, judgment made by individuals. There has to be the right of assembly and communication. But there must also be the forms of order. And there must be some sense of continuity and tradition. however limited and however shaped and reshaped over time. We cannot live without both of these elements. And in the future, I'll be talking a little more about specific examples of this conflict. And it also comes down, as you probably all know, to urban and rural, because the urban place is where the free individual can hide and hide from their own limitations. And the country is the place where people can imagine an order which excludes the other, because it's a more intimate, separate world. And in these two conditions, the urban and the rural, people can live even more comfortably with their very limited, exaggerated values. How to bring these things together, how to bring an America together organized as it was before the Vietnam War, in the culture of World War II, when we were a single nation, and when Democrat and Republican had the same friends and the same enemies. How to get to that zone where citizenship is a unifying and not a separating factor. That's the question we have to answer. And I have only begun to scratch the surface of these problems, but I'll be saying a lot more about it in our future videos and podcasts.